The last bucket of water came up from the well with a gritty film of mud floating on the surface. May stared into it, her reflection a wavering distortion in the murky water. It was August in the Wyoming Territory, 1878, and the heat had baked the promise out of the land, leaving only cracked earth and brittle, yellowed grass. This muddy water was all that was left of her parents' dream, a homestead claim they had worked to the bone for, only to be taken by fever 2 winters past. At 18, May was the sole heir to a failing farm, a dying well, and a debt to a man who smiled too much. Her gray Cheong Sam, the simple silk dress her mother had sewn for her, felt heavy in the oppressive air. It was a practical garment, made for work, but in the town of Harmony Creek, it was just another thing that marked her as different. She tipped the bucket, pouring the precious, cloudy water into the trough for her 2 thin cows. They drank greedily, their bony hips stark against their hides. She had 3 chickens, a small patch of wilting corn, and a mortgage note held by Mr. Alistair Sterling, the owner of the largest cattle ranch in the valley. The note was due in October, right after the harvest she knew would never come. The sound of a horse's hooves on the hard-packed road made her look up. It was Sterling, astride a magnificent black gelding that seemed to soak up the sunlight. He was a man in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed silver beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. He always dressed as if he were heading to a meeting with the territorial governor, his suit clean and his boots polished, a stark contrast to the dust that coated everything else in her world. He reined in his horse at her fence line, not dismounting. "Miss Jing," he called out, his voice smooth and pleasant. It was a voice that never seemed to sweat. "A harsh summer we're having." May nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not invite him onto her property. "It is, mister." "Sterling." "I was just riding the line, checking on my own stock," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the vast expanse of his land that bordered hers on 3 sides. "It occurred to me that things must be difficult for you, a young woman, all alone." His gaze drifted from the thirsty cows to the withered corn stalks. "A pity. Your father was a good man, a hard worker." The praise felt like a stone in her throat. "My father knew this land," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He did, Sterling agreed easily. "But even the best farmer can't make it rain. I've come with a proposition, Miss Jing, a neighborly one." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his polite smile never wavering. "I'll take the land off your hands. I'll pay off the note in full, and I'll give you enough to see you settled comfortably in a boarding house in Cheyenne. You wouldn't have to worry about another thing." The offer was an insult wrapped in kindness. The land was worth 10 times the value of the note, especially with the creek that ran along its western edge, a creek that was still flowing despite the drought. It was her water he wanted, not her well-being. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her spine straightening, "but the farm is not for sale." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Stubborn, like your mother. A respectable quality, but not always a practical one. The offer stands until the end of the month. After that, well, business is business." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was both courteous and dismissive. "Good day, Miss Jing." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over her like a shroud. May watched him go, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. He was right. She was being impractical. She had no help, no money, and soon no water. But selling meant letting go of the last piece of her parents she had left. It meant admitting defeat, not just to the drought, but to men like Sterling who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. She went back to the house, a small clapboard structure her father had built with his own hands. Inside, the air was still and hot. She sat at the small wooden table, the mortgage note lying under a chipped porcelain cup. She had until October. 2 months. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. She did not yet know that a decision was coming much sooner than that. It would arrive that very evening, walking out of the twilight on worn-out boots. He appeared as the sun was bleeding its last orange light across the horizon. A tall man, leading a tired-looking buckskin horse. He was covered in dust, his face shadowed by the brim of a stained hat. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if every step was measured against his own exhaustion. He stopped at the gate, his eyes on the water trough. May had been sitting on the porch, too weary to light the lamp, too worried to sleep. She stood up, her hand resting on the porch post. Strangers were not always a welcome sight. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice raspy with thirst, "I don't mean to trouble you. My horse and we've come a long way. I saw your trough. I was wondering if I might have a little water. I can pay." He reached into his pocket, but May shook her head. To deny a man water in this country was a sin. "There isn't much," she said, her voice betraying more of her own worry than she intended. "And it's muddy, but you're welcome to it." He opened the gate and led his horse to the trough. While the animal drank, the man took off his hat, revealing a tangle of dark brown hair and a face that was younger than she'd first thought. He had kind eyes, though they were weary and carried a deep sadness. He ran a hand through his hair, wiping sweat from his brow. "My name is Arthur Vance," he said, looking at her. "I'm grateful." He took a ladle from his saddlebag and dipped it into the trough, drinking the murky water without hesitation. He drank 2 full ladles before he seemed satisfied. "I am Mei Jing," she replied. He nodded, his gaze taking in the small farm, the dry fields, the general air of struggle that clung to the place. He saw it all in a single sweeping glance. He looked at her small frame, the quiet determination in her posture, and something in his expression softened. "You're on your own here?" he asked gently. "I am." He was silent for a long moment, looking from her to the darkening landscape. "I'm looking for work," he said finally. "I'm handy with livestock, can fix near anything that's broken, and I'm not afraid of the sun. I don't need much in the way of pay." He paused, then made the offer that would change the course of her life. "Tell you what, you give me a place to sleep, and I'll work for my keep. I'll sleep in the barn and ask nothing else." May stared at him. It was a reckless proposition, taking in a complete stranger. The townspeople already whispered about the lone Chinese girl on the old Jing homestead. Having a man living in her barn would give them reason to shout. But then she thought of Sterling's polite, predatory smile. She thought of the dry well and the withering corn. The world was full of dangers. Some you could see coming, and some you could not. Sterling was a danger she knew. This man, Arthur Vance, was an unknown quantity. But as she looked at him, standing there in the fading light, she saw not a threat, but a flicker of possibility. It was a foolish, desperate gamble. "The barn is empty," she said, her heart pounding in her chest, "and the roof leaks on the north side." A small, tired smile touched his lips. "I can fix a roof." Therefore, in the face of a certain and coming disaster, she chose the uncertain path. She let the stranger stay. The next morning she woke to the sound of a shovel striking hard earth. Arthur was already up, his horse tethered near the barn, and he was digging. He had chosen a spot 100 yards from the old well, a place shaded by a lone, struggling cottonwood tree. "The ground is softer here," he said when she approached, not breaking his rhythm, "and the tree is still green. That means there's water, deep down." May watched him work. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. The sun rose higher, beating down on his back, but he did not slow. She brought him a jar of water and a piece of yesterday's bread. He thanked her, ate quickly, and went back to digging. For 3 days that was the rhythm of their lives. She tended to her meager chores, and he dug. The hole grew deeper, wider, the pile of excavated earth becoming a small mountain beside it. On the 3rd afternoon, Mr. Sterling returned. This time he brought 2 of his ranch hands with him. They sat on their horses by the fence, watching Arthur work. "Miss Jing," Sterling called out, his voice laced with mock concern, "I see you've acquired some help." May walked to the fence, placing herself between Sterling and Arthur. "Mr. Vance is working for me." Sterling laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Is he now? Digging for gold, is he?" He looked at Arthur, who had paused his work and was now leaning on his shovel, watching them. "You're wasting your time, friend. That well has been dry for a month. Everyone knows it." "A well can be moved," Arthur said, his voice even. "And I suppose you're a water witch?" Sterling sneered. "Let me give you some advice. This land is played out. You'd be better off moving on. There's nothing for you here." The threat was clear. He was not just talking to Arthur. "I find my work where I can," Arthur replied calmly, "and I've been paid for this job." Sterling's eyes narrowed. He looked at May, his smile gone completely. "I made you a fair offer, Miss Jing, a generous one. You'd be wise to reconsider it before you find yourself with nothing at all." He spurred his horse, and his men followed, leaving them once again in a cloud of dust. The confrontation left a chill in the air despite the heat. May looked at Arthur, a new fear taking root. She had not just invited a stranger onto her land. She had drawn him into her conflict. "You should go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He is a powerful man. He will make trouble for you." Arthur looked at her, his expression serious. "Trouble finds me whether I'm moving or standing still. Besides," he added, a glint of defiance in his eyes, "I hate a bully." He turned back to the hole and drove the shovel into the earth with renewed force. But what he found in the bottom of that hole an hour later would prove Sterling both right and wrong. He hit solid rock. A thick, impenetrable shelf of shale that ran deep and wide. The new well was a failure. The sound of the shovel striking the stone was a death knell for the hope that had begun to bloom in May's chest. Arthur climbed out of the hole, his face grim, his clothes soaked with sweat and covered in dirt. He didn't have to say a word. She could see the defeat in his shoulders. All that work for nothing. The last of her hope withered under the relentless sun. That evening a heavy silence fell between them. May made a simple meal of rice and salted vegetables. She took a plate out to the barn, expecting to find him packing his meager belongings. Instead, he was sitting on a hay bale, sharpening the blade of his shovel with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound. "I'm sorry, Miss Jing," he said without looking up. "I thought I could find it." "It is not your fault," she replied, setting the plate down beside him. "The land is what it is." She hesitated, then sat on another bale a few feet away. "Mr. Sterling will be pleased." Arthur stopped his work, the silence returning, deeper this time. "There's the creek," he said, his voice low. "It's still running. We could dig an irrigation ditch." "My father tried," May said, the memory painful. "The land is too high. The water won't run uphill." "Not all of it," he countered, finally looking at her. His eyes were intense. "There's a low point in the south pasture. If we start the ditch far enough upstream, the grade might be enough to carry the water to the cornfield. It would be a lot of digging, a week, maybe more." It was another gamble, another monumental task that could end in failure. But as she looked at him, at the stubborn set of his jaw, she realized he wasn't offering her false hope. He was offering her a fight. He was offering to stand with her against the inevitable. It was more than anyone had offered her in 2 years. "Eat," she said softly. "Tomorrow we will need our strength." For the next week they worked side by side. Arthur dug the main trench, his powerful arms carving a line through the baked earth. May followed with a smaller spade, clearing the loose dirt and shaping the banks of the narrow channel. The work was grueling. The sun was merciless. Her hands, accustomed to household chores, blistered and bled. Arthur showed her how to wrap them in strips of cloth. He never complained, never slowed. He worked with a quiet, relentless focus that was both inspiring and a little frightening. In the evenings, they would sit in the growing dark, too tired to speak, and share a meal. In those quiet moments, she learned things about him without him saying a word. She saw the way his hands, though calloused and rough, could be gentle as he checked his horse's hooves. She heard the quiet way he spoke to the animals, a low murmur of reassurance. She began to see the man beneath the dust and exhaustion. He was steady. He was kind. And he was hiding a deep well of sadness. She knew, because she had one just like it inside herself. Sterling and his men rode by every day, watching their progress with open amusement. They saw 2 desperate people engaged in a fool's errand. They did not see the bond being forged between them, a trust built not on words, but on shared labor and a silent understanding. They were 2 solitary people who had found in this shared struggle a strange sort of companionship. On the 8th day the ditch was complete. It stretched for nearly half a mile, a thin brown scar on the landscape, connecting the flowing creek to the dying cornfield. The moment of truth had arrived. Together they walked to the head of the ditch where Arthur had built a small temporary dam of rocks and mud. "Ready?" he asked, his hand on a large rock. May could only nod, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He pulled the rock free. A trickle of water seeped through, then a gush. The creek, diverted from its course, flowed into the man-made channel. They watched, holding their breath as the water began its slow journey. It moved sluggishly at first, soaking into the parched earth. But then, as the channel filled, it began to flow. They walked alongside it, following its progress, their feet kicking up dust just inches from the life-giving stream. It crept past the south pasture, past the barn, and then, finally, it reached the edge of the cornfield. The first small fingers of water spread out among the withered stalks, turning the pale dust to dark, rich mud. May fell to her knees, touching the water with her hand. It was real. It was cool. It was life. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back streamed down her face, mixing with the dust on her cheeks. Arthur stood over her, his expression unreadable, his shadow a protective presence. He had not just brought water to her field. He had brought her hope. And in that moment, under the vast and different sky, May knew that her feelings for this quiet stranger were becoming something far more complicated than gratitude. But she did not yet know that the water he had brought to her land would also bring Sterling's wrath down upon them with the full force of the law. The very next day, a notice was nailed to her fence post. It was a legal document, signed by a territorial judge. It declared that Alastair Sterling had filed a senior water rights claim to Harmony Creek, based on a survey conducted 5 years prior. The document gave May 30 days to cease and desist diverting any water from the creek or face fines and the seizure of her property. It was a checkmate. Arthur's cleverness and their back-breaking labor had been for nothing. Sterling had used the law itself as his weapon. That night, the barn felt smaller, the air thick with their shared defeat. Arthur was staring at the legal notice which May had brought inside. His face was a mask of cold fury. He was waiting, Arthur said, his voice a low growl. He waited for us to do the work, to prove it could be done. Now he'll take it. He clenched his fists, the paper crinkling in his hand. This is what men like him do. They don't build, they take. There was a personal venom in his words that went beyond her own predicament. May watched him, seeing the old sadness in his eyes now ignited with a fresh, burning anger. "What will we do?" she asked. He looked at her, his anger seeming to recede, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. "There's nothing to be done. He has a judge's signature. His claim will predate yours. You can't fight that." He looked away, out the open barn door at the moonlit fields. "I should have known. I've seen this before. I should have. I've brought you more trouble, May." It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange and yet perfectly natural on his lips. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You brought me water. You gave me a chance. That is more than I had." She took a step closer to him. "Tell me what you meant when you said you have seen this before." He was silent for a long time. Then he began to speak, his voice quiet, telling a story he had clearly carried alone for years. He spoke of a family ranch in Texas, of a father who believed in a handshake over a legal document. He spoke of a powerful neighbor, a man much like Sterling, who had used the law to divert their river, bankrupt their ranch, and take everything they had. Arthur had been young, hot-headed. There had been a confrontation. A man had been hurt. Not badly, but enough for the powerful neighbor to press charges. Arthur had been forced to flee, leaving his family to face the ruin alone. He had been drifting ever since, a man without a home, running from a past he could not outrun. "My real name isn't Vance," he said at last, the confession hanging in the still air. "It's Cameron, Arthur Cameron." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was a physical presence in the small space. "I'm sorry I lied to you." May looked at the man before her, a man who called himself a coward, but who had stood up to a bully for her. A man who felt he had abandoned his family, but who had worked himself to exhaustion for a stranger. She saw not the lie, but the reason for it. She saw the honorable man trapped by a past mistake. "Your name does not matter to me," she said softly. "I know who you are." A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. In that moment, the wall between them crumbled. He was no longer just a hired hand, and she was no longer just his employer. They were two people, bound by a shared enemy and a shared sense of loss. "There might be one way," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He walked over to her father's old workbench, sifting through a pile of papers and ledgers left behind. "Your father's homestead papers. The original claim. When did he file it?" "In 1863, she said, "right after the act was passed." Arthur's head snapped up. "Are you sure?" "I remember him talking about it. He and my mother came from California. They were one of the first to settle in this valley." Arthur's eyes lit up with a fierce, desperate light. "Sterling's survey was from 5 years ago. That's 1873. The Homestead Act gives the claimant rights to the water on their land. If your father's claim from 63 is properly filed with the Territorial Land Office, it predates Sterling's claim by 10 years. It would supersede it." He held up a dusty, folded document. It was her father's copy of the original filing. "We have to go to Cheyenne. We have to check the official record." It was a sliver of a chance, a long shot based on a 10-year-old piece of paper, but it was more than they had a moment ago. It was everything. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days by wagon. They traveled mostly in silence, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. Arthur drove the team, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, while May sat beside him, the precious document wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in a basket. The city was a noisy, bustling hub of activity, a world away from the quiet solitude of the farm. The Territorial Land Office was an imposing brick building filled with clerks and the smell of paper and ink. They waited for hours before a harried-looking clerk finally called them forward. Arthur, speaking for them, explained the situation calmly and clearly, presenting her father's copy of the claim. The clerk, a man named Peters with a green eye shade and ink-stained fingers, looked at them with skepticism. "Sterling is a big man in this territory," he said, his voice low. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "We are sure," May said, finding her voice. With a sigh, Peters disappeared into a back room filled with towering shelves of ledgers and file boxes. The minutes stretched into an eternity. May's hands were slick with sweat. Arthur stood beside her, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor. Finally, Peters returned. He was holding a large, dusty ledger. He opened it on the counter, his finger running down a page of spidery script. He stopped. He read it once, then again. He looked up, a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even respect, in his eyes. "Well, I'll be," he breathed. "It's here. Filed July 12th, 1863. Jing, Way. 160 acres. The plat map clearly marks the creek as the western boundary. The claim is sound." He looked from Arthur to May. "Your father's claim predates Sterling's by a decade. His water rights are subordinate to yours. Mr. Sterling can't divert a drop without your permission." Relief washed over May so powerfully her knees went weak. Arthur put a steadying hand on her arm. It was done. They had won. They returned to Harmony Creek not with a victory parade, but with a quiet, profound sense of triumph. An official letter from the land office arrived a week later, and Arthur nailed it to the fence post directly over the spot where Sterling's notice had been. Sterling and his men rode by once after that. He stopped, read the new notice, and looked at May and Arthur standing on the porch. His face was a thundercloud. He said nothing. He simply turned his horse and rode away. He never bothered her again. 3 months later, the farm was transformed. The corn stood tall and green, heavy with ears. A small, thriving vegetable garden flourished near the house. The cows were healthier, and May had even been able to buy a few more chickens. The debt to Sterling had been paid off with the proceeds of their first miraculous harvest. The land, which had been on the verge of death, was now teeming with life. One evening in late autumn, as the air grew crisp and the leaves on the cottonwood turned to gold, May and Arthur sat on the porch, watching the sun set. The silence between them was no longer born of exhaustion or uncertainty, but of a deep and comfortable companionship. "My father would have liked you," May said softly. "He would have been grateful." "I think," Arthur said, his voice gentle, "that I'm the one who should be grateful." He turned to look at her. In the soft twilight, his eyes held a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "You gave me a place to stop running, May. You let me be Arthur Cameron again." He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, but his touch was tender. Her hand fit in his as if it were made to be there. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. They had faced down drought and despair, a powerful man and their own pasts. Together, they had cultivated more than just a piece of land. They had cultivated a home. And they had discovered that sometimes the most important things in life are not built, but saved. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.